the first week of December, the air crisp with winter's arrival, and the small suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek was already showing signs of the holiday season. Wreaths appeared on front doors, inflatable snowmen dotted lawns, and the faint smell of pine and cinnamon drifted from houses where families were preparing for Christmas. For most, this was the best time of the year. For Daniel Miller, it was more than just the best. It was sacred. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to leave things half done, especially when it came to Christmas. He had grown up in a household where the holiday season was celebrated with warmth, light, and spectacle. His late father had strung lights along every inch of their childhood home, while his mother baked enough cookies to feed the entire block. Now, as an adult with his own family, Daniel carried that tradition with pride. That year, he decided to go bigger than ever before. He planned an elaborate display of lights that would cover not only his house, but also his front yard, the trees lining his driveway, and even a towering 15-foot artificial Christmas tree that would sparkle with synchronized lights and music. It wasn't just decoration to him, it was a way of keeping the spirit alive, a way of sharing joy with everyone who passed by. The setup took days of hard work. Every evening after returning from his job, Daniel climbed ladders, ran extension cords, and carefully arranged thousands of LED lights. His wife and kids pitched in, handing him tools, testing lights, and cheering when whole sections blinked to life. By the end of the week, the Miller house had been transformed into a winter wonderland. On the first night he turned the display on, neighbors came out of their homes to see. Cars slowed down as they passed, drivers lowering their windows to get a better view. Children squealed in delight, pointing at the lights that danced in rhythm to classic Christmas songs. For many in Willow Creek, it felt like the official start of the holiday season, but not everyone saw it that way. The next morning, Daniel found a letter taped to his front door. It was from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, stamped with their official logo and signed by the HOA president, a stern woman named Marjorie Hayes. The letter was curt. Your holiday lights are excessively bright and disruptive to the neighborhood. Please remove or significantly reduce your display immediately, or fines will be imposed. Daniel frowned. The HOA had never bothered him before, even when he had put up slightly larger than average displays in previous years. His neighbors seemed to love it, at least those who had spoken to him directly. The kids next door had even thanked him for making Christmas feel magical. Still, here was the HOA, declaring his lights a problem. At first, Daniel brushed it off. Maybe it was just a formality, he thought. Maybe someone had complained, and the HOA felt obligated to act. He assumed it would blow over. After all, what harm could Christmas lights really cause? They weren't blaring music late into the night, they weren't blocking anyone's driveway, and they certainly weren't dangerous. But by the second evening, when Daniel switched on the lights again, he noticed something different. Marjorie Hayes herself was standing at the end of her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at his house. She lived 2 streets over, far enough that she couldn't possibly be affected by the brightness unless she went out of her way to see it. And yet, there she was, staring as if Daniel's holiday cheer was a personal attack. The following morning, another letter appeared. This one was more aggressive, warning of daily fines if he didn't comply. It also claimed his lights were a nuisance and an eyesore to the community. Daniel couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Everywhere he looked, houses were strung with lights. True, none were as grand as his, but that was the point. His display was meant to stand out, to spread joy. Still, the situation didn't sit right with him. He began asking his neighbors if they had complained. Every single one he spoke to said the opposite. They loved the display. Families admitted to taking evening walks just to show their kids the lights. Some even suggested starting a neighborhood tradition of lighting competitions. No one seemed bothered, except Marjorie, and apparently the HOA board she controlled. By the third letter, Daniel knew he had a fight on his hands. The HOA threatened fines of $200 per day until he removed or dimmed his display. To most people, that might have been intimidating enough to back down. But Daniel wasn't wired that way. To him, it wasn't just about lights anymore. It was about principle. Why should a single person, or even a board, get to dictate joy and tradition, especially when the community clearly loved it? So, Daniel made a decision. He would not back down. Instead, he doubled down. He added even more lights, extended the display further, and incorporated a charity component, encouraging visitors to donate canned goods for a local food drive. If the HOA wanted to frame his lights as selfish or disruptive, he would make them a symbol of giving. The following weekend, the Miller house became more than a decorated home. It became an attraction. Cars lined the street, families came from nearby neighborhoods, and children posed for photos in front of the glowing display. Local businesses even offered to sponsor parts of the setup, donating gift cards and prizes for visitors who contributed to the food drive. The more the HOA pushed back, the more support Daniel received. And though Marjorie's glare grew colder, with each passing night, there was no denying the truth. The community was on Daniel's side. But behind the smiles and cheer, a storm was brewing. Marjorie wasn't done. She had the HOA rules, the power of fines, and a stubborn determination to crush what she saw as defiance. And Daniel, equally stubborn, wasn't about to let her win. The battle of Christmas lights had only just begun. The letters kept coming, each one sharper than the last, printed on the same bland HOA letterhead but dripping with venom in every word. By now, Daniel had received 5 official notices, each escalating the supposed violations of his holiday display. The first claimed the lights were too bright. The second added disruptive to neighborhood harmony. By the 5th, the accusations had spiraled into absurd territory, alleging his decorations were a public safety hazard and a violation of community aesthetics. Daniel wasn't surprised. He had quickly realized that this wasn't about lights at all. It was about control. Marjorie Hayes, the HOA president, prided herself on enforcing rules with an iron fist. She had fined people for leaving trash cans visible an hour too long, for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list, even for leaving basketball hoops in driveways. She thrived on making herself the center of authority, and Daniel's display was the first real act of defiance she couldn't ignore. What shocked him most wasn't the HOA's hostility. It was the sheer contrast between the board's letters and the response from the community. Every evening, more people gathered outside his home. Some were neighbors, others were visitors from nearby towns who had heard about the house with the amazing lights. Families snapped photos, couples walked hand in hand through the glow, and children stood wide-eyed in awe. One night, Daniel noticed something that changed the course of the fight. A group of local high school students arrived, carrying cardboard, boxes, and clipboards. At first, he assumed they were just there to enjoy the display, but soon he realized they were organizing donations for the food drive he had started. They weren't just collecting from visitors, they had created flyers, posted on social media, and encouraged their friends to bring canned goods. That week alone, the Millers collected over 800 pounds of food, filling their garage with boxes stacked to the ceiling. Word spread quickly. A local newspaper published a story titled, "Christmas Lights Spark Community Spirit in Willow Creek." The article praised Daniel's dedication and highlighted the charitable impact, painting the display as a beacon of generosity rather than a nuisance. Of course, Marjorie was livid. The very next morning, Daniel received not 1, but 3 new letters. One threatened legal action. Another accused him of conducting unauthorized commercial activity because of the donations. The third was a personal note from Marjorie herself, hand-signed in looping cursive. "You are undermining the authority of this HOA. Remove your display immediately or face serious consequences." Daniel couldn't help but laugh as he read it aloud to his wife. The irony was rich. While the rest of the community saw joy and goodwill, Marjorie saw rebellion. The more she tried to frame the lights as a violation, the more ridiculous she looked. Still, her threats weren't empty. The HOA had the power to fine, and those fines were starting to stack up on paper. Officially, Daniel now owed nearly 2 ONs in penalties. The situation escalated further when Marjorie attempted a more direct strike. She arranged for a private security company, hired under HOA funds, to patrol the neighborhood and monitor Daniel's property. The guards were instructed to document infractions, but it quickly became clear they were there to intimidate. Cars slowed in front of Daniel's house, not with admiring families inside, but with uniformed men snapping photos. Visitors grew uneasy, unsure if they were doing something wrong by simply stopping to admire the lights. Daniel refused to be cowed. Instead, he doubled his efforts. He installed a donation drop-off station at the edge of his yard, complete with a sign, thanking contributors. He added even more synchronized displays, this time incorporating patriotic red, white, and blue segments alongside the Christmas colors. It wasn't just a holiday display anymore. It was a statement of pride and defiance. The turning point came when the local news returned for a follow-up. This time, a TV crew arrived, filming footage of the lights and interviewing visitors. Parents spoke about how their kids begged to see the display every night. The high school students were interviewed about the food drive, now approaching nearly 2 tons of donations. The segment ended with a sweeping drone shot of the glowing Miller home set against the dark December sky, captioned with the words, "A neighborhood divided by holiday cheer." When that segment aired, Daniel's house became famous overnight. Social media lit up with praise. Comments flooded in from people across the state and even the country, calling him an inspiration. Strangers drove in from hours away just to witness the spectacle in person. Local businesses donated even more goods, and a regional radio station offered to sponsor the display next year. But while Daniel's star rose, Marjorie's position weakened. Neighbors who had once tolerated her strict enforcement began questioning her leadership. At the next HOA meeting, murmurs of discontent echoed through the room. Residents asked why so much money was being spent on legal threats and security instead of community improvements. Some even suggested a recall election to replace the board entirely. Still, Marjorie wasn't ready to surrender. She doubled down once again, sending a formal cease and desist letter drafted by the HOA's attorney. It demanded immediate removal of the lights, citing bylaws about excessive nuisances and threatening a lawsuit for breach of contract. The letter was dense with legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. She was preparing to drag Daniel into court. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of the fight. Lawsuits were no small matter. They took time, money, and energy, things he couldn't throw around lightly. But as he looked out at the glowing display, at the cars lined up on the street, at the boxes of food waiting to be donated, he realized something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. The lights had become a symbol for the whole community, a stand against unnecessary control, and a reminder of what the season truly meant. If Marjorie wanted a war, Daniel would give her one, and this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. By mid-December, what started as one family's Christmas tradition had grown into something far larger than Daniel ever imagined. His home had become the unofficial heart of Willow Creek, drawing crowds night after night. Families bundled in. Coats stood shoulder to shoulder. Children clutched steaming cups of hot cocoa, and car after car lined the street to catch a glimpse of the dazzling display. What was once just lights on a house had transformed into a community gathering place. People brought folding chairs to sit and watch the synchronized shows. A group of local musicians even set up on the curb one night, playing live Christmas carols to accompany the lights. The canned goods drive swelled into an operation so large that a regional food bank sent trucks to pick up donations directly from Daniel's driveway. But for every smile in the crowd, there was Marjorie Hayes, growing more furious by the day. The HOA president could no longer deny that her crusade against Daniel had backfired spectacularly. Instead of shaming him into compliance, she had turned him into a folk hero. And worse, her actions had sparked something she could no longer: control, unity among the very people she used to intimidate. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years now found their voices. At the latest HOA meeting, residents openly challenged her leadership. Parents spoke about the joy Daniel's display brought their children. Elderly residents said the lights lifted their spirits in a way they hadn't felt in years. Even those who usually avoided conflict admitted that the HOA's behavior was out of line. For the first time, Marjorie wasn't greeted with nodding heads and quiet obedience. She was met with frowns, crossed arms, and whispered conversations about whether it was time for her to step down. Daniel didn't attend that meeting. He wasn't a man who enjoyed confrontation. But word spread quickly. His wife came home with stories of how the room had nearly erupted when Marjorie tried to justify the thousands of dollars spent on legal threats and private security. Residents demanded to know why their HOA fees were being drained on something as petty as Christmas lights. Marjorie, flustered and defensive, lashed out, insisting it was about upholding standards. But the more she talked, the more isolated she became. Outside of meetings, the resistance took on a life of its own. Neighbors began decorating their houses more extravagantly than ever before, in solidarity with Daniel. By the second week, entire streets were glowing with lights that rivaled his. Some families even coordinated their displays to sync with his music, creating a connected spectacle that spanned blocks. What had once been one home's display now looked like a small festival. The movement caught the attention of more than just local news. A regional TV station aired a segment highlighting how one man's fight against his HOA had sparked a town-wide tradition. The headline read, "When HOA said no, Willow Creek said yes." The piece showed sweeping shots of the lit-up neighborhood, interviews with neighbors praising Daniel, and even clips of kids explaining how much the lights meant to them. It was a public relations nightmare for Marjorie. The harder she tried to paint Daniel as the villain, the more she looked like the Grinch trying to steal Christmas. And still, she didn't stop. 2 weeks before Christmas, Daniel received an official notice of intent to sue. The HOA, represented by a law firm paid from association funds, filed paperwork accusing him of violating noise ordinances, creating traffic hazards, and damaging community reputation. The language was harsh, designed to intimidate, but it only hardened Daniel's resolve. He reached out to an attorney of his own, not just for defense, but for offense. His lawyer quickly discovered that the HOA was on shaky ground. Their bylaws were vague, their enforcement inconsistent, and their fines often arbitrary. In fact, several of their actions could be considered harassment. Daniel wasn't just in a position to defend himself, he might actually have grounds to sue them back. But before any court dates could be set, something unexpected happened. One evening, as the lights flickered to life and music filled the air, Daniel noticed more people than usual gathering at the end of the street. At first, he assumed it was just another crowd forming to watch, but then he saw the signs. Handmade posters reading "We support the lights" and "Save Christmas in Willow Creek" bobbed above heads. A small group had organized a rally, chanting in support of Daniel and calling for Marjorie's removal. It wasn't loud or disruptive, nothing like what the HOA accused him of. It was peaceful, filled with families holding candles, singing carols, and showing solidarity. The moment was so powerful that a local news crew, tipped off by residents, arrived to film it. By the next morning, the footage had gone viral online. The video showed neighbors standing together, voices rising in song as Daniel's house glowed behind them. Comment sections exploded with support. Strangers from across the country posted messages of encouragement. Donations poured in for the food drive, some even mailed from states away. Daniel received letters from families saying his story had restored their faith in community spirit. The message was clear. This wasn't just about one man versus an HOA anymore. It was about people everywhere standing up against overreach, against needless control, and for the simple right to celebrate joy. Marjorie, meanwhile, was reaching her breaking point. She called emergency board meetings, fired off angry emails, and even threatened to resign if the community wouldn't respect her authority. But the tide had already turned. Neighbors who once feared her now openly laughed at her threats. Rumors of a recall election grew louder, and petitions began circulating. For Daniel, the transformation was surreal. He had never intended to start a movement. All he wanted was to keep a family tradition alive. But now, every evening when he stepped outside, he saw more than lights and decorations. He saw people coming together, strangers becoming friends, neighbors turning into allies, and a community standing united. Still, beneath all the cheer, he knew the fight wasn't over. The HOA's lawsuit loomed like a storm cloud. Marjorie wasn't the type to give up easily, and if she couldn't win with threats or intimidation, she would try to win in court. But as Daniel looked out at the glowing streets and the smiling faces of people gathered in front of his home, he realized something. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. The community was with him, and together, they weren't just going to defend the lights, they were going to protect everything they represented. The real battle was only beginning. The morning after the rally, Daniel awoke to find his email inbox flooded with messages of support. Some were from neighbors offering to testify on his behalf, others from strangers who had seen the news coverage and wanted to contribute to his food drive. Among them, though, was the most chilling email yet, a scanned copy of the lawsuit the Willow Creek HOA had officially filed against him. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was real. The document stretched on for pages, filled with accusations. That seemed designed to overwhelm rather than hold water. It claimed his display violated community harmony, created unsafe levels of traffic congestion, and even alleged that the synchronized music was a form of noise pollution. It sought not only the removal of his display, but also damages to the HOA in the tens of thousands of dollars. Daniel sat at his kitchen table reading every line, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just Marjorie's personal vendetta anymore. It was the entire weight of the HOA's resources coming down on him. For a moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. Fighting fines was one thing, but lawsuits were a whole different world. The stress, the money, the time. What if he couldn't keep up? But then he thought about the rally. The posters, the carols, the families who had shown up to stand by him. He remembered the boxes of food stacked in his garage, waiting to be sent to families in need. He thought of the children whose eyes lit up every night when the display came on. This wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger. So he called his lawyer. The attorney, a calm and sharp man named Greg, reviewed the lawsuit and quickly found holes. The HOA was leaning heavily on vague bylaw language, interpreting nuisance and aesthetic harmony as if they were universal laws. But courts didn't usually side with that kind of subjectivity, especially when a community overwhelmingly supported the activity. Even better, Greg discovered that the HOA had bypassed some of its own procedural requirements before filing, which could weaken their case significantly. With that knowledge in hand, Daniel decided not only to defend himself, but to go on the offensive. Greg filed a counterclaim accusing the HOA of harassment, abuse of authority, and misuse of association funds. It was bold, but it sent a message. Daniel wasn't backing down. The news of the lawsuit spread quickly. Local media jumped on the Baja story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle, one family fighting against an overreaching HOA determined to snuff out holiday cheer. National outlets soon picked it up, and before long, Daniel found himself at the center of a media storm. He wasn't just a man with Christmas lights anymore. He was a symbol of resistance. As the court date approached, tensions in Willow Creek grew. Marjorie, once feared, now walked the neighborhood under a cloud of disdain. Residents who had quietly tolerated her for years now openly avoided her, whispering behind her back. Some even plastered signs in their yards reading, "We stand." With the lights and "Recall the HOA." Marjorie retaliated with even more letters, citing bylaws about yard signage and threatening fines to anyone who displayed them. But the effect was the opposite of what she intended. Instead of silencing dissent, it fueled it. Within days, the neighborhood was covered in signs, a sea of opposition she couldn't control. On the day of the first court hearing, Daniel walked into the courthouse with his wife at his side and dozens of neighbors trailing behind. They filled the gallery, a show of solidarity so strong that even the judge remarked on the turnout. Marjorie sat on the opposite side with the HOA's attorney, her lips pursed tightly, her eyes narrowed into daggers. The proceedings began with the HOA's lawyer presenting their case. He spoke of bylaws, of harmony, of visual pollution. He painted Daniel as a reckless homeowner who had disrupted the peace of the neighborhood for his own selfish enjoyment. But as he droned on, the evidence told a different story. Photos of the display weren't garish. They were beautiful. Video clips showed families smiling, children laughing, and food donations piling high. Far from disruptive, the display looked like the beating heart of a happy community. When it was Greg's turn, he dismantled the HOA's case piece by piece. He pointed out the vagueness of the bylaws, the inconsistency of their enforcement, and the lack of any measurable harm caused by the lights. He highlighted how the HOA had wasted thousands of dollars on security patrols and legal threats while the neighborhood rallied behind Daniel. And then he dropped the hammer, the counterclaim. Greg presented evidence of harassment, multiple threatening letters, baseless fines, and attempts to intimidate Daniel with private security. He argued that the HOA had acted not as a governing body but as the personal weapon of its president. When he mentioned Marjorie by name, several neighbors in the gallery nodded or whispered in agreement. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions. At one moment, when the HOA's lawyer tried to argue that the lights created unbearable brightness, the judge raised an eyebrow and asked dryly, "So, they're too effective at being Christmas lights?" The courtroom erupted in muffled laughter, and even Daniel felt the tension ease for a moment. By the end of the day, no ruling was made. The case was continued for further review. But the momentum had shifted. It was clear that the HOA wasn't the unstoppable force it pretended to be. And outside the courthouse, as Daniel stepped into the cold December air, he was met with cheers from neighbors and supporters alike. Marjorie, meanwhile, stormed past the cameras, refusing to give a comment. Her iron grip on Willow Creek was slipping, and everyone could see it. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Daniel felt like victory was within reach. Yet he knew Marjorie wasn't finished. She was too stubborn, too prideful to back down quietly. And as Christmas Drew closer, he braced himself for whatever desperate move she might try next. The calendar edged closer to Christmas, and the tension in Willow Creek reached its peak. What should have been a season of joy had become a season of conflict, and all of it centered on one house and one woman determined to destroy it. The lawsuit hung in the air like a storm cloud, unresolved but ever present. Daniel tried to carry on as usual, checking the lights each evening, greeting visitors, managing the growing mountain of food donations. But there was no ignoring the unease. Neighbors whispered about what Marjorie might do next. Some joked that she would try to cut the power lines herself. Others wondered if she would resign before she was forced out. But Marjorie wasn't the resigning type. On the Friday before Christmas, Daniel awoke to a frantic knock on his door. His next-door neighbor stood outside, pointing toward the front yard. Overnight, someone had slashed several of the electrical cords powering the display. Entire sections of the lights were dead. The towering artificial tree stood dark and lifeless, a black silhouette against the morning sky. Daniel's stomach sank. The display was more than just decorations. It was a promise to the community. And now, on the eve of the busiest weekend of the season, it was broken. He spent the morning assessing the damage. The cords hadn't frayed naturally. They had been deliberately cut, clean and sharp. This wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. Neighbors gathered in his yard, shaking their heads in disbelief. Everyone knew who the prime suspect was. Though, no one said her name aloud. Daniel filed a police report, but the officer who responded could only nod sympathetically. Without proof, there was little they could do. But word spread quickly, and by that evening, the neighborhood was buzzing with anger. Families showed up not just to see the lights, but to help repair them. Electricians volunteered their skills. Teenagers ran errands for supplies. Within hours, cords were replaced, lights rewired, and the display was restored brighter than before. When Daniel flipped the switch that night, the crowd erupted in cheers. What Marjorie, or whoever had cut, the cords, intended as sabotage, had instead strengthened the community's resolve. The lights danced across the house, the music rang out louder, and for a moment the neighborhood felt untouchable. But Marjorie wasn't done. The next day, she sent a mass email to all residents of Willow Creek. In it, she accused Daniel of fabricating vandalism for sympathy and claimed his lights were causing serious disruptions to emergency access. She attached blurry photos of cars lined on the street, insisting they blocked ambulances and fire trucks, though anyone who had been there knew traffic was orderly and well managed. The email backfired spectacularly. Instead of swaying residents, it pushed them further away. People replied all with angry messages, calling out her lies, demanding she step down, and even mocking her claims. Within hours, the email chain became a thread of rebellion, neighbors uniting in digital protest against their HOA president. Sunday, things came to a head. A group of residents gathered signatures for a formal petition to recall Marjorie and replace the board. Dozens signed within hours, and momentum grew so quickly that it was clear her days of unchecked control were numbered. For Daniel, it felt like vindication. The lawsuit still loomed, but the court of public opinion was firmly on his side. Each night the crowds grew larger, turning the display into something more like a festival. Food trucks parked nearby. Musicians returned with instruments. The high school choir even performed carols on the lawn. What had begun as one family's display had transformed into the event of the season, and that, finally, was too much for Marjorie to bear. On Christmas Eve, as families gathered in front of Daniel's glowing home, Marjorie made her move. She marched down the street in her heavy winter coat, clutching a stack of papers in one hand and her phone in the other. She demanded that Daniel turn off the lights immediately, waving what she claimed was an emergency injunction. Her voice rose above the music, shrill and furious, calling him a menace, a danger, and a disgrace. The crowd fell silent, watching as the HOA president staged her dramatic confrontation. Parents pulled their children closer. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. For a moment, it felt like all the joy of the evening was about to collapse under her rage. But then, something happened Marjorie hadn't expected. One by one, the neighbors began to step forward. First, a father carrying his young daughter, then an elderly couple arm in arm, then teenagers holding signs they had made for the rally. They formed a line between Daniel's yard and Marjorie, standing shoulder to shoulder in quiet defiance. No one shouted, no one argued, they simply stood, united. Marjorie's tirade faltered. Her words grew weaker as she realized no one was on her side. The injunction she waved looked flimsy under the glow of the Christmas lights, and when she tried to shout over the music, the choir began singing louder, their voices rising in harmony, until her words were drowned out completely. For the first time, Marjorie looked small, outnumbered, outmatched, and stripped of her authority by the very people she once controlled. She turned on her heel and stormed back down the street, her angry footsteps crunching in the snow, her threats fading into the night. The crowd erupted in applause. Daniel, overwhelmed, stood silently for a moment, taking it all in. The lights glowed brighter than ever, reflecting off the smiling faces around him. In that moment, he understood that the real victory wasn't about the lawsuit or even the display. It was about this: neighbors coming together, standing up for one another, and proving that no single person could crush their spirit. But even as the crowd celebrated, Daniel knew the fight wasn't truly over. The lawsuit still lingered, the HOA still had technical power, and Marjorie wasn't the type to disappear quietly. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The community had reached its breaking point, and from here on out, things would never be the same. Christmas morning arrived crisp and quiet, the streets of Willow Creek dusted with a fresh blanket of snow. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a moment of peace. His family opened presents around the tree, laughter echoing through the house, the warmth of the holiday shielding them from the storm outside. But outside their walls, the battle was far from forgotten. Marjorie's meltdown on Christmas Eve had spread like wildfire. Several neighbors had recorded the confrontation on their phones, and by dawn, the footage was circulating online. The video showed her storming through the crowd, shouting and flailing papers, only to be drowned out by the choir singing carols. Captions like HOA, President tries to cancel Christmas, and the real-life Grinch of Willow Creek trended on social media. The reaction was swift and merciless. Commenters mocked her antics, calling her petty, power-hungry, and heartless. National outlets picked up the story, framing it as the ultimate showdown between community spirit and authoritarian control. For the first time, Marjorie wasn't just disliked in her neighborhood, she was infamous across the country. Meanwhile, Daniel's display reached legendary status. On Christmas night, hundreds gathered once again in front of his house, singing and cheering beneath the dazzling glow. Cars stretched for blocks, headlights flickering like an unofficial extension of the lights themselves. The food drive broke records, with donations exceeding £10,000, enough to feed hundreds of families through the winter. But the biggest shift came in January, when the HOA held a special meeting to address the growing crisis. Attendance overflowed the small clubhouse, with residents packed shoulder to shoulder, their frustration palpable. Marjorie tried to call the meeting to order, but the room buzzed with murmurs of dissent. When she attempted to lecture the group about standards and order, she was shouted down. The petition to recall her had gathered more than enough signatures. That night, a vote was held, and for the first time in her long reign as HOA president, Marjorie Hayes was removed from power. The decision was nearly unanimous, with only a handful of loyalists raising their hands in her defense. The board dissolved soon after, replaced by a temporary committee made up of residents who actually wanted to serve the community rather than control it. Their first act was to suspend all fines levied against Daniel and formally drop the lawsuit. Their second act was to draft new bylaws that limited the board's authority, ensuring no one person could wield unchecked power again. Daniel sat quietly in the back of that meeting, his wife at his side. When the vote was announced, the room erupted in cheers, and neighbors turned to him with smiles and pats on the back. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he wanted was to put up Christmas lights. But somehow, he had become the catalyst for change. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek transformed. Where once the neighborhood had been tense and divided, now there was a sense of camaraderie. Families who had barely spoken to each other before now greeted one another warmly. Neighbors who had once feared fines and reprimands now felt free to plant flowers, paint fences, and decorate their homes without anxiety. As for Marjorie, she disappeared from the spotlight. Rumors swirled that she had sold her house and moved away, unable to face the embarrassment of her downfall. Others claimed she stayed but rarely left her home, her curtains drawn tight, her once frequent patrols of the neighborhood gone. Whatever. The truth, her reign was over. For Daniel, life slowly returned to normal. The display came down after New Year's, stored carefully in boxes for next season. The garage, once overflowing with food donations, was finally clear again. His family resumed their routines, but something had changed. Everywhere he went, people stopped him to thank him, not just for the lights, but for standing up, for showing that one person could make a difference. The following December, Daniel once again began unpacking boxes of lights. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Neighbors showed up with ladders and extension cords, eager to help. What had once been his project had become a neighborhood tradition. Houses across Willow Creek coordinated displays, creating an unbroken stretch of lights that glittered for miles. A year later, the town itself joined in. The mayor declared the Willow Creek Christmas Lights Festival an official annual event, sponsored by local businesses, complete with parades, markets, and live performances. What started as one man's tribute to family tradition had grown into something that drew visitors from across the state. And every year, when the first switch was flipped and the lights sprang to life, Daniel felt the same swell of pride. Not just because of the beauty of the display, but because of what it meant. The lights were no longer just decorations. They were a symbol of resilience, of community, of standing up to pettiness and control, and of the simple joy of sharing something good with others. Looking back, Daniel often wondered how different things might have been if he had given in to that first letter. If he had dimmed the lights, taken them down, or let Marjorie's threats scare him into silence. It would have been easier in the moment, but the neighborhood would have lost something far greater. Instead, he had stood firm. And because of that, Willow Creek had found its light, not just on rooftops and lawns, but in the spirit of the people who lived there. The HOA had said his Christmas lights were too bright, but in the end, the town and the world beyond, it had made it clear you can never have too much light in the darkness.